Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Whispers of the Deep. My name is Draken. Today we are looking at Chapter 7, Aeril 2. So, Aeril 2 follows the events of Lucian 2 and Fortuna 2 by a couple hours, happening later that night, but not yet quite the next day. So, on a structural level, Aeril 2 is very different from every other chapter so far, as it is a chapter wholly done in soliloquy. It is entirely from Myro's perspective, and he is the only character in the entire chapter. There is no real dialogue, and even when other characters are mentioned or seen in the chapter, is within a memory of Iril's. So this chapter is incredibly sparse on dialogue, and it is structurally different. To give a brief rundown of the chapter, Iril has a nightmare about a monster from folklore, then wakes up, reminisces about his past romantic experiences and his feelings for Fortuna. After that, Iril drinks some wine and reads up on the lore of this monster he had a dream about. This chapter helps us get more into Iril's head, but more than this seemingly very mundane description of the chapter, a close reading of this chapter actually reveals there are many, many things going on here, and it is up there with Lucian 2 as one of my favorite chapters so far. I know I've said that about the past three chapters, but I am a big fan of these three chapters. So when we go through this chapter, I'm not going to say everything that's going on because I don't want to give away some things, but I will tell you that if you piece together some things, you will understand a bit more, shall we say. And as always, let's begin with the epigraph. So this epigraph comes from Otis the Traveler's Geographies. Fun fact, Otis here is a play on the Greek Otis, or no one, which is the name Odysseus uses to um, give a false name to Polyphemus in the Odyssey. So essentially, this is the travels of nobody. But this this passage is incredibly interesting. So it talks about how primeval man had ascribed meaning to the heavens, but this is something we know. This is something that appears in our culture as well as the cultures of Whispers of the Deep. However, we also get the distinction of two distinct cultures within the general regions of the Empire Noria that we know of so far, which is the people in the White Hills and the people in the plains. The Sarkaians, which is where Ekin is from, the White Hills, or at least the foothills of which is where Iroh and the Murulai are from. And we have the description of a Karen culture, which is an honoring the dead by heaping up stones on top of the mountains to get further up, and a Undercroft culture, which is the Circaeans and the people on the plains um who build undercrofts to worship their ancestors. So the reason I use the term Karen culture and Undercroft culture is because when archaeologists look at like old, no longer extant cultures, oftentimes the way they use to describe them are based off of what materials they leave, say types of pottery or types of grave structures, because these are things that survive in the archaeological record. So it would not be uncommon to find a culture and call them like the round bottom pot with wavy lines or something like that. The round bottom pot with wavy lines culture, or the wavy line culture, or say the hunting motif culture, if all the archaeological pottery sherds or something like that come from a specific region. So we have the Cairn culture and the Undercroft culture. And it seems that the Marulai are from the Undercroft culture because that's how they do their ancestral worships. So beyond that, we also have this understanding of there's another ethnic group called the Kertari and others who, as well as the people of Theiss, which is this central island in the middle of the map, but they tell of the Red Moon's coming and how the gods gave it so mortals might track the year's progression in perfect clarity. So, to give a brief, it is not yet fully explained in the story, but the way the year functions is that there are 12 months in the year. Each month is 30 days exactly, with the red moon having having a full cycle of 60 days. So it's 30 to from new to full, 30 from full to new. And then there are 6 cycles of that for the year. So the year is perfectly 360 days, separated into 12 perfect 30-day increments, which compared to our 365.25 something days and a lunar cycle of 29-ish days, it's rather dramatic that the red moon is so precise. And in fact, Iroh says, "Oh, the red moon is full. That means the year is half done." Which means if this is if this is similar to our world, it would say just our world names, then it is happening in then this story is happening in January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, September, December. So it's happening essentially at the beginning of July, which is where the story is right now. Say 6 months done, or 7 months done. So it's happening on July 1st, essentially, which is when Iroh 1 is happening, more or less. The Iroh 1, this entire series of chapters. To continue, the idea that the red moon's coming means there's this deeply ingrained idea in cultures across the land that the red moon wasn't always in the sky, and it emerged later. In fact, with the association of the red moon with Eroter and the white/alabaster moon with Cabera and the sun with Dios, there's also this idea of the red moon coming later. This might be significant. So let's begin. The darkness calls to Iroh. So the beginning of the chapter is a nightmare Iroh has. However, we very quickly learn that this isn't any normal nightmare. Something is different. That Iroh is down in the chasm of the crypt. However, farther down than he's ever been before, yet somehow is able to recognize it by the rawness of the walls, implying that although it's stone bricks at the top of the chasm of the crypt, as you go further down into the sinkhole or the tower or whatever it is, the rock gets rougher and rougher and rougher. And then we have water somewhere nearby, water is trickling. So we actually learned in Iroh 1 that water trickling along the walls of the chasm of the crypt only happens in winter. And Iroh says it is summer in this chapter, which means the dream is not happening contemporaneously. The dream is happening at a different period in time. Similarly, similarly to this dream happening in a different period of time, Iroh is not himself. Based off the description of the light being slightly different, his pace being slightly different, his height being slightly different, Iroh is in a body other than his own. And then here with the invocation of emerges, it is a historical present to really draw the reader into the dream. That we have this being of darkness imperishable, this supernatural entity of darkness and the void, essentially. Yet the void with 2 eyes of purest gold. Again, the black and gold motif, which might mean this entity has something to do with what we saw in the prologue. And it has a sword made of darkness imperishable. And Iroh meets it, and dream logic, their sword is now another blade of jet black stone. Now, a blade of stone makes us think of the stone gray or stone green blades of reworked orichalcum, but this is jet black stone, so it's not exactly true orichalcum. It's not exactly reworked orichalcum. It is some other material, most likely. And the thing talks about Iroh having a daughter who's a bearer of his curse. Now, so what kind of curses can be transmitted from a parent to a child? That's something. There's some biblical invocations of sins of the father, sins of the son, and how that kind of spiritual taint is carried down through the generations, but 4 generations. But Iroh recognizes the voice as the Lord of Blackbirds, and then he wakes up, looks at his hand. Just strange. You'll have to forgive the music in the background. There's someone who lives next door to me, but so Estelle is the goddess of dreams and sleep and night and things like that, from the Latin stella, stars. She's the goddess of of just that kind of nighttime vibe. And dream was with the type that the dream that type kept Serena Stella shy and secret, which means it's the type of nightmare that when you have, you're not going back to sleep because it was too frustrating. And Iroh, here we have the quiet of night, which means the storm is past. Iroh gets up and walks over to the window, and here we have another interesting piece of lore. So we have the Rooks, which is this organization that this Brother Preston character, which we haven't seen yet, was part of. We have the Rooks, which are this organization that Iroh's himself going to join, and they hold light and day sacred, and so they consider the moon sacred, and the eclipse more so, because the moon, well, in our sciences, we know the moon, the light of the moon is in fact the light of the sun reflected off the moon. The idea that the moon is sacred might mean that the Rooks believe this to be the case of some degree. But more fascinating is the idea of the eclipse of the moon being sacred. So if the Rooks hold the sun and moon to be sacred, the eclipse, if the moon is the messenger of their god, then an eclipse is knowledge transmitting from the sun to the moon to earth. So the eclipse or the solar eclipse represents to the Rooks divine dispensation of knowledge. But here again, here that the red moon is not sacred to the heron, or the yellow heron, which is the god of the Rooks. So again, we get this idea that the sun and the moon in this world are natural. There's something unnatural about the red moon. We don't know what it is, though. And why is it not sacred? The Lord of Blackbirds. Tyrell thinks of them. And he thinks of his grandfather, Sir Aurel Argent, with his burnt fingers. And we have this image of Aurel having burnt Aurel's namesake, who burned his fingers in a fire at an early age. Now, this is sort of the invocation of the midrash of Moses, who is given the option of a burning hot coal and a ruby, and he chooses the hot coal and puts it into his mouth because he's a baby, and that's why he's a speech impediment. So you have this idea of Aurel as being someone who is differently able because not exactly having use of one of his hands. And Aeril is holding flames in his hand in the dream. So and Aeril looks at his hand. So there's this connection of Aeril and his grandfather Aurel that we are playing up. And he thinks of the Lord of Blackbird's omniscient and goes through the different people he has slept with in his life. So we have four people. We have an innkeep's daughter, a novice in the Temple of the Triarchy, someone he met in Shadow Alley in Fair Calais. And then finally we have someone who he had relations with before leaving Lapsia, so leaving Erdonia. In a previous draft of the story, Lapsia was the name, but I changed it to Erdonia because it would make sense. It would make more sense that the region of the map would be named after the people who ruled it since time immemorial, which are the Aedonites. Aedonite becoming Erdonia. So this basically confirms this idea that has been hinted at a little bit in previous chapters that Fortuna and Aeril had some kind of romantic engagement in the past, and it did not go well. In fact, Aeril transitions from thinking about his previous romantic engagements to specifically thinking about Fortuna, which further implies this. And when they say the things they whispered under the stars by the cliff's edge, while this describes the topography of Fair Calais, which is two hills with a river running between it, and Shadow Alley being on the southern bank of that river in the shadow of the Tell. The other thing is that this describes the gorge where we have the events of Fortuna 1. So Iroh says, oh, I don't think any of them conceived, but he doesn't know that. Why would he know that? He's been gone for years. But also maybe he's just in his own head too much. We honestly don't know. And then Iroh questions, why had he gone down to see Fortuna? Why had he asked Fortuna to see him in that place they call ours? And the conclusion he comes to is that it was simply to wonder if it was enough to say, if I'm leaving behind the Rooks, will it be enough to console me that Fortuna at least still has feelings for me, or at least still cares for me? And the answer he got was really a non-answer. That no, not really, essentially. And then here we get another, probably one of the more significant lore revelations of the chapter, which is in Iroh 1, we get teased this amulet, and then we get teased this amulet again in Lucian 2, where Iroh reaches into his cloak, into his tunic, and pulls out a different amulet, the Medallion of the Rooks. But this is his actual amulet, the one that he has not showed anyone, not even Fortuna, that he must have taken it off at some point. And we have it when he's found it when he was 8, so 2 years ago, and Iroh's 20. And they found he finds Iroh goes into this ruin connected to the Chasm of the Crypt, because we know the storerooms are built into the Chasm of the Crypt. They find him several hours later, and we he's clutching an arm, and his arm is broken. We don't know how that's happened. And then when Iroh heads back, he starts having epileptic fits, which in olden days, epilepsy was called the falling sickness or the seizure sickness, namely because you are being seized by the god. The idea is that epilepsy is a symptom of divine possession or spiritual possession. So it's like, to quote the title of a certain book, when the spirit catches you and you fall down. But Iroh as a kid had epilepsy specifically after this event, but the epilepsy cleared up at some point. So we don't know exactly what caused it. Also, so it says bad air was what caused it, but we know in our world at least that miasma theory isn't really a thing. That the idea of bad air causing disease by itself or causing a malady by itself is just medically wrong. So this would imply to us at least that there's some other cause down there that began his epileptic fits. So Iroh then sneaks out and then finds a fortune teller with this bauble that is the size of an apricot, a small yellow fruit, but is pure black and has a white line on it that looks like so the whole thing looks like an eyeball, And Iken actually asks about it being an eyeball, and fortune teller, the fortune teller has this weird speech pattern where they reduplicate everything. They say, one might think, not for mine, not for mine. What I knew, what I knew. These are the only lines we get of this fortune teller, and is the reduplication of each word each time. So he asks, is it meant to look like an eye? And they say, you might think. But do you think it looks like an eye? And Iroh says, obviously I think it's an eye. I said so. But is an eye? And the crone says, the crone's cackle was as thunder. We only know of a couple other characters whose speech is described as thunder. You can check that for yourself if you want. But the they say, is it? And they say, not for mine. It is not for me to say if it is an eye, actually. But its name's ancient, lost beneath sea and stone. So it's something that's incredibly old, but the fortune teller has no idea what it does and asks if it frightens Iroh. And Iroh says, no, it doesn't frighten me. What does it do? Which, how would the fortune teller know it does if its name isn't even known? Maybe there'd be some way of remembering. Maybe not. Maybe Iroh's just asking stupid questions. So the woman, in fact, says, I have no idea what it does. What I knew what it did. And Iroh trades his mysterious sword hilt they caught somehow from, like, I don't know, a crypt attached to the chasm of the crypt. But he gets this bauble now that he thinks is the most beautiful thing in the world. That the shadow bird is a bird that sings, and it's this plumed bird that sings, and immolite is a starry purple mineral. And this entire thing of Iroh getting the falling sickness and finding this strange sword hilt deep beneath the earth, and then sneaking out and finding the fortune teller, and then getting this bauble from them. It smacks of prophecy, if you would. It feels almost cosmically fated based off of how this series of events has transcribed. And he says, someday you'll reveal to me your secrets. When that day is, who's to say? So Iroh then is connected to the moons, guided by the moons, and pulls out Dusty Codex. Codex is an old term for a book, but it's like not quite bound in the same way that modern books are bound. And then Iroh pours himself some wine. The wine is thick and dark, which reminds us of the wine, honey water mixture he offers to the spirits in Iroh 1. And this is a Lagunos is like, imagine a small little jug light with like a big bottom and a narrow stem. But this is a likeness of special wine that Egenhand had given Hyrule, which is incredibly suspicious because we already know Egenhand is someone who is letting on more than he knows and is not telling the whole truth and has some ulterior motive, and now he's giving Hyrule wine. Sounds incredibly suspicious. And Hyrule, in fact, says that Hyrule had accepted, then turning it over to give some Juliana. So Hyrule perhaps thinks it's poison, but he doesn't want to offend. So perhaps Aeril doesn't want to let on that he understands that Agenhan has something else going on. But he gives some to Julian's taste, and Julian's tastes it, and strangely enough, the taste of the wine was mild, and Aeril says the wine is anything but mild. It's astringent in one sip and overly sweet in the next. Weird how Julianus doesn't know what the wine tastes like when he was specifically asked to taste the wine. That's kind of odd, don't you think? But the thing he does get right is that the wine has a taste of cinnamon, which so Iril drinks some weird cinnamon flavored wine and has strange dreams about a character from mythology telling him he's going to have a daughter who bears his curse. Weird. That there might be something about that. Might be something about that looking into. But also the evocation of a cinnamon flavored or cinnamon scented food supplement or food, as we might say, that involves the granting of strange dreams is evocative of a certain fictional work. It might be a bit obvious which one, but no, you can find that for yourself. So, but Iroh took the wine to help him sleep because he has been not able to sleep easily. He's been on the road for 20 days, and he did not want to endure another restless night. So Iroh is somewhat restless nights. We already have Iroh having restless night, which is due to nightmares. So Iroh drinks the wine to hopefully not have nightmares, and yet has nightmares regardless. So the wine did not work, at least for its intended function, according to Iroh. And here is this interesting line of Iroh cleared his throat and began to read. So this is an interesting distinction that so many things are we take for granted in terms of culture. Even how we read is one of them. That who is to say what the correct way of reading is to read silently to oneself? That, especially in a society where literacy is lower, it could be very easily the expectation that when you read aloud. And in fact, we have descriptions from ancient Greek sources that imply when people read, they read aloud, even reading to themselves. So Iroh is in fact reading aloud to himself. Sure, he'd be capable of reading silently. We see people reading silently later, but Iroh reads aloud because it's a customary thing to do, just the way things are done. And we have the Lord of Blackbirds is an ancient legend, and we have some storyteller called Genji the Elder who created a work called Timetables of Antiquity, which basically puts in the chronology of a bunch of different stories and myths and legends. But here we have an interesting one of Lady Snaya and her son Prince Dagon Caveborn. This is the second instance we've had of the idea of women finding young boys in caves. Might be important. Who knows? But also that the Lord of Blackbird's legend is incredibly ancient. And I'm not going to say that, well, I'm going to say that many things in the story are allegorical, but the Lord of Blackbird's legend is in particularly allegorical. So the Lord of Blackbirds is a singer's son. So his father's a singer, but his mother's art is the one which teaches him to learn the language of all the birds. And he is he seems to have some kind of connection to the Cairn culture because he lives on a mountaintop and wants to create a ladder, read Jacob's ladder, to get to the heavens, except he's not an angel, and he gets 1,000 blackbirds to help him, but they're not blackbirds. He says that you were once blackbirds, that you had this glorious history of being blackbirds and are no longer blackbirds, but I can make you blackbirds again, not by actually turning into blackbirds, but by painting your feathers black. But it doesn't work. All the effort, it doesn't work. So the Lord of Blackbirds burns down his home. But by having this form of human sacrifice of lashing women to each of the hill's 100 wing limbs, because the smoke carries him up, it's implied that this sacrifice, perhaps of his own sister, someone who would share his lineage to get himself to the heavens, but it doesn't work. The actual results are one, that there are the creation of these birds, which basically are blackbirds now, because they were called blackbirds, they call each other blackbirds, and now they are tainted by the smoke, which has stuck the paint to their skin. So they are blackbirds effectively now, even if they didn't call themselves, but or that people always recognize them as these blackbirds because that's what they've undergone. As with Lord of Blackbirds, he falls into a cave. And so in this chapter, we have the evocation of caves, and then in Lucian 2, in Fortuna 2, in all over, we have this idea of Iroh being associated with the darkness of the deep earth. We always saw was down in the darkness of the deep earth, so in the prologue. So one might think that Iroh is with his family's sigil being a blackbird, and with the repeated evocation of having a bird on his shoulder, one might get the idea that some cosmic force might be conspiring to have Iroh be susceptible to the Lord of Blackbirds, whatever they represent, whatever they are. In fact, the Lord of Blackbirds is said to be someone who eats little boys and girls, who eats little boys, not little girls, just little boys. Is a Lord of Blackbirds is a monster who eats people going where they shouldn't. So the Lord of Blackbirds is a story like of the boogeymen saying, don't go in the dark places of the earth because the Lord of Blackbirds will be there and they will promise you things. They will promise you flesh, gold, and power. And these are things Iroh knows because Iroh has in fact been promised flesh, gold, and power. Well, he called it counting hogs, counting clothes, counting heads, counting coins. Flesh, gold, and power. Bag in hand. Then the Lord of Blackbirds, however, it seems however many children they eat, it's not enough because there's still this burned corpse. It's not enough. But they do want to try again someday. And Iroh then at the very end of the chapter loses time. He before he knew it, the lamp had gone out and Iroh felt Dawn's rosy fingers, which is a Homeric poetic construction, tapping against his shoulder, like the birds. I know it's a bit of a short chapter, but there's a lot here. Next time we're going to go over Ekin 2, which if this chapter is very sparse on dialogue, Ekin 2 is incredibly full of dialogue and is the follow-up to, well, the fun shenanigans of Ekin 1. I'll see you all there. Bye.